There was once a livestock guardian dog, a very large and almost bear-sized dog named Princess. But Princess was not simply a house pet. After all, she wouldn't really have been able to fit comfortably in the house anyway. No, Princess had a job to do. Because on Princess's property were a number of chickens. And these chickens produced eggs for both Princess and her owner. And it was Princess's job to tend to them. Sometimes a chicken would wander off in pursuit of insects or fallen seeds, but Princess steered them back to the coop. Sometimes a chicken injured itself and Princess alerted her owner to fix it. And other times, Princess scared off circling birds of prey who sought to make an easy meal out of the smaller birds. And over time, the chickens grew to trust and rely on Princess, and Princess learned to care for them as if they were her own puppies. But one night, the owner awoke to loud barking coming from Princess. As the owner rushed outside, he heard violent thrashing coming from just outside the chicken coop. As the owner finally reached the sound of the commotion, a dead coyote laid on the ground, and Princess could be seen darting into the woods after two more. Once the owner was sure it was safe, they checked inside the coop to find the chickens thoroughly shaken, but completely unharmed, with not a single one missing. The next day, Princess returned to the chicken coop, having sustained several injuries. The owner quickly brought Princess to the vet, but after hours of stitches, Princess made full recovery because she is huge and her muscles were so thick that they basically functioned as armor. And so the chickens continued to live safe and secure under the loving and watchful protection of Princess. Early in Jesus' ministry, he had many followers who would wander with him across the countryside. And the Jewish religious leaders, that is the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the teachers of the law, while they were often annoyed by Jesus' teachings and how he would humiliate them when they tried to trap him with deceptive questioning, they were not outright hostile towards him. However, as time went on, this began to change. Jesus taught and preached things that many found unpalatable, which led to many of his followers abandoning him. And as the religious leaders, for their part, became more incensed, their patience and tolerance frayed to the point of conspiracy. In fact, some of them very nearly attempted to stone Jesus to death on several occasions. It was around this time that Jesus and his remaining disciples came upon a man who had been blind from birth. Now, although there were numerous examples in the Old Testament condemning this line of thinking, there was a common belief among the people that those who were disabled had received this disability from God as a punishment for their sin. And since this man had been born blind, the disciples asked Jesus who had sinned, himself or his parents. Jesus told them that neither had sinned, and that this man had been made blind so that Jesus could show God's work in the world. And so Jesus had compassion on the man, healed him of his blindness, and sent him away in peace. However, people began to recognize the blind man and saw that he was now able to see. So they brought him before the religious authorities, more specifically the Pharisees. The Pharisees questioned him repeatedly, not believing the account that the man had given, even calling his parents to confirm that he had truly been blind from birth. And when they could not disprove the man's account, they began heaping insults upon him, and they threw him out. Later, Jesus accuses the Pharisees of spiritual blindness and launches into an explanation about who he is. And he does this using an example that everyone would have understood: the relationship of a shepherd and his sheep. See, during Jesus' time, sheep were an important commodity. Their wool could be used for cloth, for clothing, and tents. Their milk could be used for food. Their horns were hollow and can be used as an instrument, a trumpet more specifically. Or they could be used to store olive oil. If you raised and killed one, it could be used for meat. Their hides could be used for clothing and shelter, or for religious sacrifice. They provided goods that were widely used throughout the land. And while the shepherds themselves were not exactly high on the social hierarchy of the land, the results of their work was so important economically and culturally that most people were at least somewhat familiar with it. And Jesus describes himself as a shepherd of sheep in 3 important ways. The first way that Jesus is like a shepherd is that he knows his sheep. A shepherd has to spend an immense amount of time with the sheep that he cares for. That's essentially what they do all day. They open the pen and count them on the way out to ensure that nothing happened overnight. They stand guard over them, protecting them from danger. They make sure they have enough food to eat. They make sure they aren't getting into mischief. They make sure none wander too far away. And at the end of the day, they go back to the pen, inspect each one for scratches, injuries, and barbs in their wool as they enter. And it was even more intensive if they were a nomadic shepherd, guiding their sheep from one pasture to another pasture every time the grass from one area would be eaten up. Over the course of that time, the sheep would obviously be named. And with spending so much time together, the shepherd would be able to tell which sheep was which. The sheep would also grow to recognize the voice of their shepherd. And if any other voice were to call for them, they would either ignore the voice or run in fear back to their own shepherd. In this way, Jesus knows each and every one of us. He is and always has been mindful of us, caring for us and protecting us even before we came to know him. He tries to teach us and guide us, and through seeking him and listening to him, we learn to recognize his voice. The second way that Jesus is like a shepherd is that he searches for his lost sheep. Usually, sheep are relatively good at staying together with the herd. They have it psychologically ingrained in them from birth to father other older members of the herd. And this psychological need to be near other sheep usually keeps them together. But they can sometimes wander off. Most frequently, the whole herd or smaller groups of sheep will wander as they try to stay near to one another. So the shepherd has to make sure that they're paying attention and not wandering too far from him. There are other times, though, when a sheep might get lost on its own. For one, sheep have eyes on the sides of their head, which helps them to look out for predators more quickly if you have a more rounded vision. However, this means that they have very poor forward-facing vision. So if they see something interesting that they might want to investigate, they have to go all the way up to it in order to know if it's actually that tasty-looking plant that they thought that it was. And because they also have very poor depth perception, they can't tell if that plant is close or if it's very far away. So it's possible for a sheep to get distracted and wander after something that they assumed was much closer than it really was. Sheep are also herd creatures without much way of defense. The males have horns, but none of them have exceptional size, strength, or other modes of fighting off anything that would like to eat them. Now, sheep were very aware of this, and as a result, they are easily frightened. And their most trusted strategy when they get spooked is to run away as fast as they can. Again, they usually try to stay together in the pack when this happens, but sometimes the terrain can cause the group to split or scatter. Or sometimes the sheep just gets so scared that it just runs without regard to the other sheep. And so a sheep is alone and possibly injured. But a shepherd cares for his sheep. In Luke chapter 15, verses 4 through 6, Jesus says this, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep.'" I mean, for those of you who have pets, would you not drop everything to go look for one of them if they got lost? I mean, at least for me, whenever my dog escaped out the front door, it was like a family event. Everyone in the house, no matter what they were doing, would go outside to try to corral and catch him. Our parents never had to try to convince me or my brother to do this. It was just, we heard he got out and we got out to help. In this way, Jesus looks for us when we are lost. There are some Christians who wander away from God over time. Sometimes it's the result of some tragedy or inflicted pain or a crisis of faith. Or it could just be a slow walking away, not from anything bad, just simply a matter of finding our relationship with God to be less important than other things, not making it a priority. There are others who never knew God at all, people from isolated nations who've never heard of Jesus, people who have heard of him but never really knew anything much about him, or even people like we see every day who know about Jesus but don't have a relationship with him, don't know him personally. Jesus seeks after all of them, and he never stops until they're found and safe within his arms. The third way that Jesus is like a shepherd is that he lays down his life for his sheep. Now, the chance of being murdered by a sheep is low, but never zero. A male might headbutt you with their horns if you manage to corner or intimidate one. But as previously stated, sheep are quite gentle and docile creatures. And while they may get spooked by any number of things, loud noise, any number of things, sometimes actual predators do come to strike. There are many animals who would like to make a meal of them, but the most common are usually variations of wild dogs, such as wolves, coyotes, or dingoes, if you're in Australia. And while they come to attack, all the sheep can do is run. So like a livestock guardian dog, it falls to the shepherd to keep them safe during times of crisis. But it is for this reason that shepherds come prepared with the necessary tools. If you recall the story of David and Goliath from the Old Testament, David was equipped and very adept at using his sling and stone because he acted as a shepherd for his father's livestock. The sling was just two pieces of string connected to a square cloth. And when a rock was placed in that cloth, it could be swung around. By letting go of one of the strings, you could whip the rock with exceptional speed and accuracy at any attacker. Shepherds used this to hit predators at a distance, sometimes even deterring an attack before it began. But if the predator makes it in close quarters, the shepherd also had a rod, which was a kind of a small branch or club that could be used to whack the predators. But defending the sheep always had a certain level of risk. Maybe the predators came for the sheep, but they could very easily go for the human who stood in their way. Hired hands might flee for their lives because they had no vested interest in the sheep, but the good shepherd did not let this danger deter them from protecting his herd. He fought for their lives as if they were his own. In this same way, Jesus defends us from evil. When tough times come, he guides us through them. When we find ourselves in danger, Jesus sees us through. And when we find ourselves surrounded by temptation and sin, Jesus fights to keep us on the straight and narrow. In fact, his desire to see us safe from sin led him even to laying down his life for our sake. And it was on that cross that he willingly died for us. And 3 days later, he willingly took it up again so that he might continue to shepherd us. Jesus is our good shepherd. But more relevant to the story, Jesus was a shepherd to that blind man. While this blind beggar was just an insignificant person in the eyes of those around him, passing him by without a further thought, Jesus knew him. In fact, Jesus' words to his disciples imply that Jesus actually sought the place where the blind man begged so that he might heal him. And then Jesus restored his sight so that he might no longer be defenseless against the curse of poverty. Meanwhile, the Pharisees did not care for the blind man. When he was a poor beggar, there was no help for him. In fact, they viewed him as a sinner for his disability. And when he was healed, they did not rejoice or celebrate. They did not praise God. They did not spread news of this miracle, nor did they venerate the one who healed him. Instead, they only doubted his story, dismissed him, insulted him, and hurled him out. Like the blind man, we may be hurt by religious people or even religious authorities sometimes. Unfortunately, it's not as uncommon as I would like to believe. But regardless of how people might treat us, Jesus will always treat us as his precious sheep. He knows each and every one of us by name, and we can recognize his voice. When we get lost or we simply wander aimlessly, Jesus will always seek us out and track us down until we are safely in his arms again. And when we are surrounded on all sides by dangers, by hardships, by temptations, he will defend us even to his own death. And we know this to be true because he already did. Like chickens being tended and watched over by a guardian watchdog, we can rest safe and secure because we have a good shepherd watching over us. Would you all pray with me this morning? Dear Lord, remind us during hard times that you are our shepherd, that you are always with us, that you know us by name, that you will always seek us out when we are lost, and that you will fight to defend us, even laying down your life for our sake. Lord, help us to follow you and feel safe and comforted in your arms. I pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.